Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar for 6th through 12th grade teachers in our 2021-2022 series entitled Building Student Visual Literacy for a Diverse Image-Saturated World. I'm Darcy Beeman Black, and I will be your host today. So each webinar in this series delves deeper into topics around building skills with students to help them navigate the image-saturated world through reading, discussing, and researching images. Today's webinar focuses on how to talk about art. Our previous webinar focused on how to read art, and I invite you all to check it out on the Getty YouTube channel if you wish to get an introduction to looking at and interpreting works of art with your students. Also, I would like to note that while our focus in the series is on images of works of art in the Getty's museum collection, our goal is for you to be able to apply these same concepts to all different kinds of images that span well beyond our collection. We also hope to inspire you to incorporate works of art into your teaching across subject areas by showing you how easy it is to connect them to your curriculum. So, why are we talking about this? So, as museum educators, we have broad experience facilitating conversations about art featured in our galleries. We have seen the value of sharing and responding to ideas inspired by a work of art, and how discussions can uncover great learning moments for students. We also think these strategies can be a great asset for you and your students as we navigate the diverse and image-saturated world around us. So what can students learn from having discussions? Well, through discussions, students can challenge assumptions and practice learning from each other. Students can try out different perspectives they may not have considered previously, while also expressing their own opinions and viewpoints. Students can also practice listening and showing respect for others, and learn to separate ideas from the people who hold them, and practice dealing with disagreement. In a world of heightened civil discourse, practicing discussions with students and helping them work through differences can be a real asset to building citizenship and tolerance. There is also a value in experiencing group thinking. Students can learn that diversity of peers and variation of ideas can be a resource and can experience solving problems together as a group. And then also, how does discussion improve visual literacy skills? Well, we've also found that talking about art increases complex thinking and builds the language needed to express that thinking. Talking about what you see in front of you also builds ideas using a visual language. Trying to match words with what you think about what you see drives you to seek out more words to explain your ideas. Talking about art helps students to make detailed observations while also backing those observations up with evidence that they see right in front of them. And because students can see and hear other students' ideas backed up with evidence, it makes them more open to other interpretations and perspectives. And then I also pulled these bullet points from the English Language Arts Common Core standards because they offer up our opportunities to take part in a variety of conversations about a variety of media formats as a whole class, in small groups, or with a partner. There is also a focus on evaluation and use of evidence. Connections to these standards present themselves in a variety of ways in our presentation today, and we hope you can easily incorporate them, or perhaps all of them, into your curriculum. And then before I hand it over to Rebecca, if you were able to watch our last webinar, you are familiar with this blueprint for how to read an image. If you were unable to catch it, again, I recommend that you go watch it on Getty's YouTube channel. But I wanted to point out that discussions can happen at any stage of this process. But today you may find that we're sticking around in step 3, the synthesis stage, because this is where comparison, sharing, listening, connecting, and combining observations appears the most to draw conclusions about the message of a work of art. And so now that I've gone over some of the benefits and why we're talking about discussions and with students, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, who's going to delve into characteristics of a productive discussion.
Hi, everybody. So good to see you here today. So yes, as Darcy said, we're going to take a few minutes before we delve into specific strategies that you can use to talk about works of art using dialogue or classroom discussion. We want to just take a minute to acknowledge some of the characteristics that can support a useful discussion in your class. So the three that we're going to focus on today are safety, challenge level, and a consideration of where you fall on the continuum of teacher-led versus student-led conversations. We've noted this reference in the slide called The Teacher's Guide to Leading Student-Centered Discussions, talking about text in the classroom. This book was particularly inspirational to us as we thought about certain qualities of conversation in the classroom. And so we wanted to just give the book credit and also get it on your radar in case you'd like to explore some of these ideas more. So talking about safety. So this is a diagram from the book that I just referenced. Of course, having a safe discussion environment is a precursor to being able to talk about art. So this diagram gives a sense of the two ends of the spectrum of what a safe discussion environment might look like. If it's overly safe, you might have those tiptoeing qualities on the right, such as ideas aren't challenged, or the arguments that students present are weak, or the discussion isn't very engaging. If it's not safe at all, you might have students who are not participating, or students who are hurt, or general reluctance to join in. So it's good to have that in your mind as you're starting the discussion approach when you're dealing with art in your classroom. So certainly, as many of you may have already done, it's helpful to establish ground rules for what constitutes a safe conversation. And with grades 6 through 12 students, you can certainly ask students themselves to talk about what makes a good discussion. You can also model different ways of participating in discussions, different types of contributions that students can make. And you can talk about what's appropriate for you can think about what's appropriate for your specific students. So some classrooms are super talkative, others are less so. Some may have a particularly dominant group of students. So certainly it makes sense to adapt whatever discussion strategy you're going to use for the nature of your students. It's also useful to think about culturally responsive teaching strategies, and we wanted to call that out in this webinar because the notion of discussion is even culturally specific in some ways. So we want to think about how, when you're setting up a discussion in your classroom, how you're thinking about different student cultures that are in the mix. So thinking about ways of involving students from different backgrounds. Some of the strategies you can use are things like inviting connections between the image or whatever you're going to be talking about, whatever work of art you're going to be talking about, and students' past experiences. Asking for community involvement. So not just limiting contributions to the students in the class, but inviting students to involve their family members in the conversation, for example. And similarly, when you choose discussion topics, selecting topics that connect with the strengths of your students. Also, we want to just bring up the need to consider how your role as the teacher factors into the discussion. And this is something that we think about a lot also at the Getty when we're teaching in the galleries with students, is things like how our body language impacts students, how we might unconsciously give more positive feedback to one student versus another just by how we're facing our body or the expression on our face. So some of the strategies that you might consider are things like not even looking at students, but maybe looking at your piece of paper or looking at the work of art to help keep in check some of those biases. Also thinking about positive feedback. Something that I do a lot when I'm teaching is I paraphrase what students are saying to help it be heard by other students who may not have heard it, just to amplify it in a sense. But you might also want to think about how that action of paraphrasing can affect students' feelings about what they've said, depending on how well or not well you paraphrase, or how well you are capturing or sensitive to their ideas. And similarly, don't be afraid of quiet, because oftentimes it takes a little bit of space to create the comfort level for students to participate. So I'm a big fan of allowing for some silence as well. So here's just a sample list of ground rules. If you're going to be talking about art a lot, because the nature of discussion about art can be sensitive, depending on what works of art you're picking, it's helpful to establish ground rules. So here's just one example of ground rules that you could create with your students, but certainly you can work directly with students and can co-create a list of ground rules as well. Okay, so then going back to the Hale and City book that I referenced earlier, there's also an emphasis on making sure that your discussion is at an appropriate challenge level. So obviously, if the question is too hard or too easy, students may not be inspired to contribute. So when you're talking about, we wanted to explore, what does this mean specifically when you're talking about a work of art? So here's a list of types of images that support discussion. So when we're teaching in the Getty galleries, we are working with a variety of works of art, and not all of them equally contribute to a vibrant discussion. So here are some of the qualities that we've found are useful to consider when you're picking a work of art. Things like an image that's intriguing, but not totally confusing, or an image that has a lot of visual clues that can help you figure out what's going on. Images that have a combination of familiar content and unfamiliar content. Images that have connections to what else you're doing in your class. So here's some examples, and we're going to look at some concrete examples of these ideas. Also, in terms of building diversity awareness with your students, there's certain types of works of art that lend themselves particularly well to some of those higher level goals that Darcy was talking about. So for example, works of art are really helpful for social emotional learning because they depict subjects that you have to kind of figure out what's going on with them emotionally. So images where you have to put yourself in the subject's shoes or consider how they might be feeling in the circumstance that they're portrayed in, those are particularly useful for building those skills. Similarly, visual images can represent times and places and cultures that are totally different from your own. So they offer a lens into exploring those other times, places, and cultures that are different from what you might experience, say, in a newspaper. So here's some examples. Here's an example of an ancient object that tells a story from mythology. You may recognize some of the details here. So here's an example where there's a lot of visual details and clues that can help you uncover the story. There's that crab, there's the multi-headed creature with the snakes, the hydria. There's a person holding a club, which some of your students may be familiar with from when you've covered antiquity. And it presents layered narratives because there's, multi-layered story going on here. Here's another example of an image from Dorothea Lange, which she captured right before the Japanese living in California were sent to internment camps. So here's an example kind of capturing what was going on right at that time, what it was like to be a student at that time. The notion, this connects really well with those of you like in grade 12 who are doing government in your social studies classes, thinking about kind of the role of civic participation. There's a lot of amazing clues in the expressions of the children in this photograph. So it's a wonderful opportunity to explore what people might be thinking based on the expression on their face. Here's another example, and we're going to talk in depth about certain examples as we get deeper into this webinar. So this is more just thinking about how to choose an image. This one's wonderful because it contains a lot of ambiguity that would certainly inspire debate and wondering among students. And one more, which contains also a lot of clues about what the story is that the tapestry is telling. It brings us back to another time. It tells a historical story of what was happening when Jesuit missionaries were traveling to China, and kind of early versions of globalization that were happening through those interactions and sharing of technology. So those are some examples of images that we think lend themselves to really good discussions. So also it's important to think about asking a good question for your discussion, making sure that the questions that you ask to fuel the conversation are grounded in the work of art. They're very open-ended. They give opportunities for students to have a lot of different ideas about what they're seeing. One of the things that we love about using works of art as a discussion topic is that for ELL students, there's an opportunity to formulate a lot of ideas based on an image rather than having to read something. So it creates a more kind of common playing field for students who may not be on the same level when it comes to, say, reading a story. Also, it's important to think about where you are in the conversation. Some of the conversations you might have about a work of art can get very deep, and probably don't want to start out with those. Finally, and last but not least, we want to acknowledge the importance, especially in grades 6 through 12, of thinking about student-led conversations as opposed to teacher-led discussions. And you will know based on your class what will work for your students. It's maybe something that students have to practice and work up to. But we love the possibility of students interpreting a work of art with their peers through their own facilitation of conversations. Similarly, some of the advantages of a student-driven discussion is that students can have more ownership of what they're discussing. So that's something that we'll come back to a little bit more later on. So now we've kind of overviewed how we broadly think about going about discussing works of art. So with that, Darcy and I are going to take turns talking about some specific strategies with specific works of art that we hope you can find useful to adapt to your classroom.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello again. So we've decided to focus on 4 ways that you can approach facilitating discussions. The approaches we are sharing today are like not the only ways, and you'll notice there may be some overlap, but you may be able to use them all together. I don't know if you get really into it, but these are all, like Rebecca said, based on images from our collection. So the first approach that I'm going to share is a popular one that uses a very specific protocol to facilitate discussions about what students see. Visual thinking strategies, or VTS, is a great way to sort of get your feet wet if you're new to guiding student discussions about art in your classroom. The primary objective calls for students to look carefully at a work of art and share verbally what they observe. So I'm going to share this strategy using this photograph from the Getty collection called Midnight Reykjavik, number 5 by Sue Kim. Born in South Korea, Kim moved to Los Angeles in 1980 and actually teaches and heads the photography department at Otis College of Art and Design. And this photograph is one included in a 12-part series that Kim created during a trip to Iceland in 2005. Kim took a rough panorama, cut and layered multiple images together and mounted them between plexiglass. So I chose this image to demonstrate VTS because, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, there is an element of wonder in this work. And I have found that the mixture of familiar and unfamiliar has really captured the curiosity of students. Visual thinking strategies basically functions on the use of 3 questions to help students think through their ideas. So the 3 questions here are, what is happening? So after a few minutes of looking at the image, you could pose this question to students, and then their responses would drive the direction of the discussion. So for example, a student may answer with like, this space is really confusing and I'm not sure what's happening. Or they may notice that parts of the landscape are altered. Once a student shares an idea, you would then pose another question. So you would say like, well, what do you see that makes you think that? Why is the space confusing? And the student then must back up their statement with evidence that they see. So perhaps the student that pointed out that the space is confusing might say, well, there's trees inside some of these houses. Or maybe the student who pointed out the fragmented landscape might add that there's sky inside some of the rooftops. And then we would dig deeper into these assumptions and pose another question to the group or a student and say, what more can we find? Someone else may add that the trees outside of the houses look normal and that the natural elements in the photo are not altered, like the machine-made ones. So like the houses are altered, but the natural elements don't seem to be. You would then open it up again and invite more thoughts and ideas. You would use these 3 questions interchangeably to drive the conversation forward and interpret the image for meaning altogether. There are some specific tips that the VTS approach calls for on how to facilitate a discussion. So one rule that is encouraged is to physically point to the observations made by the students. So you will notice that earlier I tried to point to like the sky inside of the building so that you knew what I was talking about. This verifies that you're understanding and the other students understand and see the observation. But it also lets the students sharing the observation know that they are heard. But again, Rebecca mentioned earlier, you might think about the consistency or the approach on how you actually point. So another tip is to verbally rephrase the observation of the students. So this is also allowing for verification of understanding, but it also, helps for that everyone else understands to make sure that they do too. And then your job during VTS is to also link student ideas together. So for example, maybe after the discussion about machine-made versus natural elements being altered differently, another student may point out that the cars in the street have been cut out and replaced with tree imagery. You could connect those 2 observations to see if anyone has any ideas on what's going on here, or like, using more clues, and you could just keep expanding from there. And lastly, remaining neutral and treating all comments the same, even when you think a student is wrong, is really important to the process. So help them think through the reasoning rather than, say, oh, no, that's not correct. Here's the correct answer. It's really important to take a moment to really slow down and think through those things. There is also much more to share regarding VTS, but I did want to share these basics because they're easy to pick up and you can pretty much do it with any image. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Rebecca, who's going to share another one.
Thanks, Darcy. Okay, so our next approach to leading a discussion is focusing on supporting evidence. So we find that bringing a discussion back to what you're looking at can be a really helpful approach in grounding what you're doing in the work of art. So taking this object as an example. So here we have it's an image from Greek mythology of a battle of sorts. So we have Bellerophon with Pegasus. Bellerophon was a famous hero known for battling monsters. And here we have him battling a monster with his ride, Pegasus. So this creates an opportunity for a rich discussion about who's winning this battle. So before you get started with exploring the story that you see here, when you're focusing on supporting evidence, it's helpful to have a conversation with your class about the value of supporting evidence. So grounding your statements and your opinions in evidence that you can find. And so when you're talking about art, that's very often visual evidence, but this concept, this carries forward into other subject areas as well. And this is building on the visual thinking strategies methodology that Darcy was just presenting. Visual thinking strategies uses very specific discussion prompts. This goes a little bit beyond that, but VTS is a good way to get your feet wet when you're exploring this notion of supporting evidence. So for this work of art, you might choose a discussion question that could have multiple points of view. So for the sake of this example, I picked, who do you think is winning this battle? Because I think that's fun to talk about. So, right, because we've got three figures in the image and there's clearly some kind of a fight going on, but who's winning? So then you can have students work in small groups, in the large classroom, whatever is your style, to share their different points of view. But the really important part is to make sure as the conversation unfolds that they're supporting their points of view in visual evidence. So, and also it's useful to talk about, is it easy or difficult to find visual evidence? Because it's not always the same, it's not always as accessible depending on what you're looking at. So let's see what that looks like with this image. So here's an example. Say your point of view is Pegasus who's winning the battle. So Pegasus is the horse with wings in the kind of upper left register of the image. So what are some visual clues or evidence that a student could give to support the argument that Pegasus is winning the battle? Well, it could be that Pegasus is the tallest. It could be that the front legs are around that kind of creature monster's neck. It could be that the man below, Bellerophon, is helping Pegasus by holding him up. It could be that they could argue, well, Pegasus has wings, so he can fly away anytime the battle gets too troublesome. So those are visual clues that support that point of view. So what about Bellerophon, who's the hero, who in this image is below the two creatures? He's often portrayed above Pegasus, but in order to fit it in this round composition of this drinking cup, the artist decided to place him below. So is he winning? Well, you could argue that he's got the spear and he's stabbing that monster creature with three heads, and there's something dripping out of it. So he's winning. You could argue that he's holding the strap of the creature and is in control. You could argue that we see that blood dripping down, right? And the creature's not doing so well, and that his tongue is sticking out. And maybe that's like a sign of distress. You could argue that, well, because he's attacking from underneath, that's extra clever. So what about visual clues that could support the argument that the chimera is winning? And the chimera is the creature on the kind of the right who has three heads. One is sort of snake-like there on the end. Maybe he's winning the battle. Well, you could say he's got that spiky detail on his chest that's like armor, and so he's super strong because he's got that protection. Or you could say, well, he's been stabbed, but he's still fighting away, so he's the strongest. You could argue that it's got three heads, which means three brains to discuss about and think about how to manage this battle, and so that gives it the upper edge. So that's an example of how students can find visual clues to support their points of view. Okay, so now we'll go on to a third approach to leading a discussion about a work of art with Darcy, having to do with multiple perspectives.
So this next approach emphasizes the process of uncovering multiple perspectives as the vehicle to drive discussions with students. So the objective is to bring awareness to diversity of ideas, practice listening, and learn to respect other peers' opinions. So for this approach, I'm going to use this image taken by photographer Leonard Freed of Magnum Photos. Freed's coverage of the American Civil Rights Movement first made him famous, but he also produced major essays about socio-political events all over the world throughout his lifetime. Photography became Freed's means of exploring societal violence and racial discrimination. And in his extended essays, Freed shared that he wanted to, quote, show atmosphere and be inside and outside and see different points of view, building a story from multiple angles in order to facilitate an understanding of the subject. In this case, the subject is police work. So this photograph is part of a series that documented the daily life of New York City Police Department during the 1970s, which was famously tumultuous. So for this approach, step one is about identifying the different points of view. So students will answer the question, what is the story, to identify different points of view in the class. So students will most definitely have varying reactions and thoughts about what's going on here, depending on their individual backgrounds and experiences with the police. So using a writing prompt, we can offer personal time for the student to self-reflect. You can assign this as a homework assignment or an in-class activity. So the prompt is, choose a person in the photograph and write a first-person point of view narrative about their experience leading up to the scene. So by writing a narrative about the point of view of someone in the scene, students will be revealing a lot of information about their personal reactions to the photograph and what they think the people in the photo are thinking. So maybe the student chooses the ladies talking to the police officer on the left side. So I was sort of thinking about the lady with her hand on her hip. Sort of seems like maybe she's angry. That might, I was thinking about what the police officer's inner dialogue might be. Someone else might think they are excited and sharing something with the officer. I also wanted to offer up some other options for prompts. If you wanted to mix it up a bit, you could open it up to students to choose, or you could assign different prompts to different students. So other options I have here are maybe you're writing third person with a limited omniscient view. So we could shift the narrative to third person point of view account of one of the people in the scene. So maybe this could be an exercise where you write what one person is thinking about another person in the same area. Maybe what the police officer is thinking about the ladies who are talking to him. You could do a third person with an all-knowing view. So you could write as if you are the creator of the scene and you're narrating the thoughts and feelings of each person. Or maybe you're a person looking back on an event. So students could choose someone from the scene and write a diary entry about their experience that day, but from today's perspective. So maybe the lady smiling with the officer, what would she think about this day now after 50 years or so? And then you could also maybe write as a narrator who's recording only what you can see. So perhaps you're like a newspaper or a newsroom reporter, and you can only speak to what you see or hear, and you can only backing it up with evidence. All right, so hopefully these options can be tweaked, or if you have different needs for different students, you can switch it up a bit. So after the reflection and giving the students some space, a good way to get prepared for a whole group discussion in step 2, which is the ultimate goal, you can start with smaller group work first. So after the writing assignment, you could break students into pairs to share their stories with each other. And then after each student hears the thoughts and perspectives of their partner, you could have that student share with the whole class what the thoughts of their partner was about the photograph or the work of art that you're looking at. And then I also wanted to add, like if the writing assignment maybe isn't the best option for your students, you could start at the small group stage with this assignment. So maybe allow time for reflection before breaking students into pairs, and then have those two students together, share what their thoughts are or answer the prompt in real time. And then you could share the image ahead of time, maybe to prepare the students for the discussion. All right, and then once you give students the space to share their interpretations of the story in pairs and share them out, it's time to facilitate a group discussion about what the perspectives are of everyone. So a question like, which point of view do you agree with and why, can be a good jumping off point. And then you could start asking for different or similar opinions and work through their reasoning by asking, continually just saying, well, why? Well, why? And then at this stage, it's important to stay away from language like, so do we all agree? So the goal of this exercise is not to reach a consensus, but actually, keep the discussion going and work through differing perspectives. So you definitely don't want to give off the vibe that, we're all working to all agree. So through this group discussion, the students will become more aware of the ideas of their peers and practice listening skills, while also learning to respect a variety of opinions. So I mentioned earlier that students may have a variety of feelings and reactions to this photograph by Leonard Freed. Some students may be skeptical of the authenticity of the emotions of people in the scene. They might have different opinions about what the ladies on the left are saying to the officer, or they may have strong opinions about the inner dialogue of the lady looking out the window on the right-hand side. So giving space to work through and share perspectives with each other will help to build upon or shift their own assumptions, hopefully. And it will build skills that they can take into the world as they encounter ideas and opinions different from their own. All right, so I'm gonna pass it back over to Rebecca, who's gonna conclude the last section for us.
Building on the idea of thinking about how your peers in the classroom are thinking about objects, feeling about them, reacting to them. We wanted to share a discussion strategy that really asks students to listen closely and try and connect with their peers. And they don't have to connect, but connect as in really hear what they have to say. So while we're talking about art, we're really focusing on other kinds of soft skills, social emotional skills, and interpersonal skills that we think are really important for students in building an understanding for each other and for others in the world that they encounter. So for this approach, the focus, the example that we'll focus on is this work of art by Mexican photographer Graciela Iturbide. And one of the reasons that I picked this one to discuss is I think it fulfills that quality that I outlined earlier of having a kind of a familiarity and a foreignness. There's a kind of an ambiguity about what's going on. When we talk with students about this photograph, there's often a lot of debate about what's going on in her facial expression. And so it inspires a lot of conversation. So what does this strategy look like? We'll come back to the image. So this is a strategy where students have to focus on what their peers are saying. And this is a strategy that works particularly well when you have a class with a lot of students who like to participate, because it requires them to not just say what they think, but to really listen to others along the way. So there's a couple of variations, and I'm sure you could come up with others as well, but here are two variations where essentially you're playing a discussion game in which each time a student contributes to the discussion, they have to build on something that was said by a previous student. So variation one is that they have to build on what was immediately said before them. So that really requires listening to everything that's happening as opposed to hearing one thing and then tuning out and focusing on how you're going to respond to that while all this other conversation happens. The other less challenging version is to allow students to connect to a prior comment or question from one of their peers, but not necessarily be immediately prior. So what would that look like with this work of art? Well, so I modeled what a conversation might look like that builds on conversations that I've had with students with this work of art. So clearly everybody wonders about this collection of iguanas on top of this woman's head. And if you research this object, you'll learn that Iturbide was really interested in photographing Zapotec women in Juchitán, and that she would spend time in the farmers markets with the local people and find subjects to photograph. And in fact, this was not this was an everyday woman who was selling her wares, which happened to be iguanas, at the local farmers market. But Iturbide saw more symbolism in this woman as she was photographing her, and created this image that has a lot more symbolism. And what's interesting is if you look at the contact sheets from the photo shoot, you'll see that in many cases, the woman who's the subject is completely cracking up, like laughing hysterically as she's trying to pile these iguanas on her head. But when we look at the final image that the artist selected, we get a kind of a composure. And sometimes students also see a sadness in her eyes. So what would a conversation look like? So it could be that a student says, well, I think that the photographer wanted to make this woman look like a queen. And if you're doing this with middle school students who are focused on mythology, sometimes they might even reference Medusa. Building on that, the next student might say, I agree. The iguanas surround her head, almost like a crown, connecting it with the comment about a queen. Building on that, a student might then say something like, well, but I don't know about iguanas as a crown. Doesn't seem very regal to me. Yet another student might add, well, look at the camera angle. The photographer is looking up at her like she's somebody important. So that's an example of what it would look like for students to have to listen to each other and build on their comments on the prior person's comment. So finally, we want to just take a minute. So that was 4 different discussion strategies. There are many, many more we want to acknowledge. This is just a short selection. And we've connected them with actual examples from the Getty's collection to give you an idea of what does it look like to meld these discussion strategies with specific works of art. We want to highlight that as we do this, we're very focused on the Getty's collection because that happens to be the museum that we work for, but you can pick images from many museums have digital collections. You don't have to stick to the Getty's collection. We encourage you to look to other museums' collections as well and find other images that may connect with whatever you're studying, the curriculum that you're covering at any particular time in whatever grade that you're teaching in. And last but not least, we want to go back to that notion of student-led discussions. We decided not to present to you a specific strategy for student-led discussions because that felt counter to how we think about what it means to have students facilitating. We want to ensure that when students are leading a discussion that they're having an opportunity to kind of co-create the experience and own it. So on one hand, if your students are less experienced at leading discussions, you could guide some discussions, facilitate some discussions like this in your class, and then invite students to pick one of those facilitation strategies to try themselves. But if your students are more sophisticated in their experience with classroom discussion, they may come up with their own strategy for guiding a discussion about a work of art. And this is an approach that you could use where you divide students into teams and each student is assigned a specific work of art and comes up with their own strategy for how the class can explore that work of art. So we don't want to leave this out as a valuable strategy for exploring art in your classroom and for connecting it with the other things that you're doing in your curriculum. Okay, so then we want to just take a few minutes before we get to the Q&A of this webinar to talk about troubleshooting discussions that may not be going the way that you hoped. So certainly, as we talked about earlier on, thinking about the safety of your classroom and whether it's a safe discussion environment is really important. And I'm sure many of you already think about these issues. but we certainly want to bring this up as you're thinking about talking about art in your classroom. And then sometimes art feels foreign, feels like something that either teachers or students are less comfortable with because it's not as integrated in your usual classroom practice. So it might be that you show a work of art and students feel like, I don't know what to do with this. So thinking about how to get a conversation started when it might feel new is really helpful. So here are some examples of strategies you could use. So for example, really like an icebreaker activity that's a round robin style conversation where you have an easy question that everyone can easily answer. So here are some examples like, what's a detail that you notice, which builds and sets a platform for the visual thinking strategies approach that Darcy outlined. It's sometimes fun to talk about if you were going to rename this work of art is named fill in the blank. If you had to rename it, what name would you give it? Or do you like it? Would you hang it in your bedroom? So just choosing a low-hanging fruit type of a question can really help to get the conversation started if it's something that's not comfortable. As you get deeper into leading conversations in your classroom, you may find that you have unbalanced participation. I know that's a challenge I experience a lot when I teach in the galleries, and it's particularly challenging because I don't know the students as well. So sometimes I may not necessarily know what the classroom dynamic is with the students that are visiting us. Certainly thinking about whether the discussion questions are in the sweet spot of the difficulty level is important. And also making sure that the questions allow for lots of different successful answers and points of view. If you're planning a discussion, it's also really helpful, especially if this is something new, to front load students in advance, letting them know the day before that there's something that you're going to be talking about and sharing it so they have some time to formulate their thoughts or to go back and discuss it with family members. Similarly, and we've talked a lot about small groups, and you're all very familiar with different sorts of small group conversations. That's a way to get a conversation going that may not be working in a large group setting, or similarly, a student-led discussion. And in some cases, pre-writing, so another version of front-loading can be giving some time before the discussion starts for students to jot down some of their thoughts. And certainly, I'm sure many of you already use statements like, let's see if we can hear from someone who hasn't commented yet. So creating a space without singling anybody out for new participants to join the conversation. What if students are making a lot of off-topic comments? I've sometimes experienced that myself. And, it might be that they're distracted or whatever it might be. So how can you bring their comments back to focus on the object? So certainly asking them to directly connect it to what you're looking at can help. Sometimes something that seems like an off-topic comment actually is inspired by an observation, and the student has made several thought connections along the way, and so you may not see the connection. So sometimes asking and delving can be helpful. Okay, so with that, let's ask Darcy to come back. And I'm not sure if I saw a lot of questions.
No, we don't have any right now. So I think we had a few that were addressed privately. So we can hang out for a minute and see if anything comes to mind or if anything filters through. But yeah, if we don't have any questions, we could go ahead and conclude, unless Rebecca, there's anything else you want to add?
No.
Yeah. All right. Well.
All right. Well, so you're welcome to go ahead and wrap up. And if we see any questions pop up in the meantime, we'll try and answer them.
Awesome. Sounds good. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this webinar useful and that you'll join us again for a next webinar in the series. And then again, thank you for joining us and hope to see you again at future Getty webinars. Have a great evening.